A woman may survive the breaking of her heart, but the room that watched it happen should fear the day she returns. 3 years before the ballroom fell silent at dusk, Lillian Harper stood beneath the chandeliers of Waverly House with a white glove folded in one hand and every eye in Boston society pretending not to look at her. Music had stopped only moments earlier, though no musician had been told to stop. It had died by instinct, as sound often does when a room discovers cruelty is about to become entertainment. Across the polished floor stood Duke Sebastian Waverly, dressed in black evening clothes, his posture perfect, his face controlled with the merciless discipline of a man choosing reputation over tenderness. Lady Caroline Mercer stood near the marble column behind him, her fan open, her smile hidden just enough to be called sympathy by fools. Lillian understood only part of what had happened. A rumor had passed through the ballroom before she entered, soft as perfume and poisonous as frost. They said her family's financial ruin had been hidden so she might trap the Duke into marriage. They said her letters to him had been calculated. They said her affection was ambition wearing a pale blue gown. She had heard whispers before, of course. A poor girl moving in noble rooms hears everything meant to wound her and nothing meant to defend her. But she had believed Sebastian would ask her. She had believed he would look at the woman who had walked with him beneath winter trees, who had read to his blind aunt, who had never once asked what his title could buy, and he would know the room was lying. Instead, he looked at her as though society had placed a veil between them, and he had chosen to trust the veil. "Your Grace," Lillian said, her voice low enough that only the nearest guests could hear. "May I speak with you privately?" Sebastian's eyes moved briefly toward Lady Caroline, then back to Lillian. That glance was the first wound. The answer was the second. "There is nothing private left to say, Miss Harper." Someone behind her inhaled. A gentleman lowered his glass. Lillian felt the heat rise in her face, but she did not lower her chin. "Then you have heard something and judged me without asking whether it is true." His jaw tightened. For 1 second, she thought she saw pain beneath the cold. Then pride closed over it. "I was mistaken in your character." The sentence did not sound angry. That was what made it unforgivable. Anger might have meant he was hurt. This was worse. This was dismissal delivered as moral certainty. Lillian's fingers tightened around the white glove until the lace pressed into her palm. She could have cried. She could have pleaded. She could have turned toward the ballroom and begged one honest person to say that they had seen her love him before they had seen her poverty. But the room was not waiting for truth. It was waiting for collapse. She would not give it one. "No," she said quietly. "You were mistaken in your courage." His face changed, barely, but enough that she knew the words had entered. Lady Caroline's fan paused midair. The silence widened. Lillian curtsied, not deeply, not submissively, but with the exact grace her mother had taught her when their gowns were already being turned and retrimmed to hide what they could no longer afford. Then she crossed the ballroom alone. Every step seemed longer than the last. The chandeliers trembled above her. The floor reflected her pale blue skirts like water beneath ice. No hand reached for her. No voice called her back. At the doors, she paused only once, because some foolish, loyal part of her still believed Sebastian might speak. He did not. So Lillian Harper left Waverly House without a tear on her face, while behind her the music resumed too softly, as if even the violins were ashamed. Outside, dusk had turned the snow along the carriage drive silver. Her mother waited in the hired carriage with a shawl around her shoulders and worry already in her eyes. "Lillian," she whispered. Lillian climbed in, closed the door, and placed the folded glove in her lap. "We are leaving Boston," she said. Mrs. Harper did not ask what had happened. A mother knows when a daughter's voice has become older between one breath and the next. The carriage rolled away from Waverly House, past glowing windows where people would rebuild her into scandal before supper ended. Lillian looked back only once. In an upper window, she thought she saw Sebastian's silhouette, still and dark against the candlelight. Perhaps he watched her go. Perhaps he did not. It no longer mattered. That night, society learned how easily it could break a powerless woman by making one powerful man doubt her. But it did not learn the more dangerous truth. A heart can break and still keep its name. A woman can be cast out and still remember the shape of every face in the room. And one day, if she survives with enough dignity, she may return at dusk not to be chosen again, but to make the ballroom answer for its silence. For 3 years, Lillian Harper learned the difficult art of living unchosen. She and her mother left Boston before the first full snow melted from the carriage roads, carrying 2 trunks, a box of books, and the kind of silence that follows public ruin when defending oneself would only give society more words to rearrange. They settled in a small coastal town in Maine, where the Atlantic struck the rocks below the bluff with a patience that made human gossip seem almost childish. There, no one cared that Lillian had once danced beneath chandeliers beside a duke. No one whispered that the Harper name had become unsuitable. No one washed her gloves to see whether poverty had mended the seams. She became Miss Harper of the girls' school, the teacher with steady hands, pale dresses, and a voice calm enough to make frightened children believe grammar could be survived. Each morning, she walked half a mile through salt wind to a white clapboard schoolhouse with green shutters. She taught reading to daughters of fishermen, sums to girls whose fathers kept shops, penmanship to shy children who pressed too hard on the page because no one had told them gentleness could still leave a mark. She taught them history, but not the kind written only by powerful men. She told them that a woman's name was a house she carried inside herself, and no cruel room had the right to tear down its walls. The first time she said it, Mrs. Harper looked up from the mending basket near the stove and understood that her daughter was not speaking only to the children. Lillian did not become bitter. Bitterness would have tied her forever to the ballroom that had broken her. Instead, she became clear. She learned which invitations were traps, which compliments carried hooks, which silences protected peace, and which silences allowed lies to grow fat. She learned to sleep without waiting for an apology. She learned to wake without rehearsing what she should have said. Some evenings, when the schoolhouse emptied and dusk turned the sea pewter, she would stand at the window and remember Sebastian Waverley's face when he said he had been mistaken in her character. The memory no longer made her knees weaken. It made her breathe slowly, as one breathes while lifting something heavy but familiar. Her heart had healed crookedly around the wound, and she did not despise it for that. A crooked healing is still healing. In Boston, Duke Sebastian Waverley continued to be respected. Newspapers mentioned his donations. Mothers mentioned his title. Men mentioned his judgment. Yet Waverley House changed after Lillian left. The ballroom was closed under the excuse of repairs that never began. The winter music evenings ended. No engagement was announced, though Lady Caroline Mercer remained near enough to be photographed in speculation and far enough to deny ambition. Sebastian carried on with flawless manners and a face that gave society nothing to feed upon, but servants noticed what society did not. He no longer paused at the ballroom doors. He no longer used the blue sitting room where Lillian had once read aloud to his aunt. He no longer answered when anyone mentioned the Harper family. A man may win the approval of a room and still be haunted by the woman he chose not to believe. 3 years passed that way. Then, on a fog-heavy morning in October, a cream envelope arrived at the coastal schoolhouse, edged in silver and sealed with the crest of Waverley House. Lillian recognized the seal before she touched it. Her fingers did not tremble, but the children noticed she dismissed class 5 minutes early. At home, she placed the envelope on the kitchen table between the teapot and her mother's sewing basket. Mrs. Harper read the invitation first. A charity ball at Waverley House. The reopening of the ballroom. Funds to support schools for girls. Lillian gave a short, quiet laugh, without humor. How generous of them to discover girls after ruining one. You need not go, her mother said. I know, but you are thinking of it. Lillian looked toward the window, where fog blurred the harbor into a gray dream. I am thinking that some rooms believe absence is confession. Mrs. Harper was silent for a long time. Then she rose, went to the old writing desk, and unlocked the lower drawer. From inside, she removed a folded letter tied with green ribbon. Lillian turned. What is that? Her mother's face had aged gently in 3 years, but her eyes were clear. Something I should have given you when rage was still fresh. I waited because I feared you would return for revenge and lose yourself to the same room that harmed you. She placed the letter in Lillian's hands. But you are not the same girl now. Lillian untied the ribbon. The handwriting was elegant, familiar, and cold. Lady Caroline Mercer's hand. Each line revealed what gossip had hidden. Instructions to suggest that Lillian had pursued Sebastian for money. Mention of a marriage broker. Assurance that a duke would always choose reputation if the room pressed him hard enough. Lillian read to the end, then folded the letter carefully. No tears came. Only a stillness so complete it felt like standing inside the eye of a storm. Mrs. Harper touched her wrist. "A quiet woman may forgive in private," she said, "but her name must be restored in public." Lillian looked down at the green ribbon, then toward the sea. 3 years ago, she had left a ballroom because one powerful man trusted the room more than her heart. Now the room had invited her back. This time, she would not go to be chosen. She would go to make the silence choose truth. On the same morning that Lillian Harper opened Lady Caroline Mercer's letter by the gray sea, Duke Sebastian Waverley stood before the locked ballroom doors of Waverley House and wondered why the air behind them felt colder than any winter room. The servants had uncovered the chandeliers at dawn. Men on ladders polished crystal until it caught the pale October light. The parquet floor had been waxed until every window and column returned in blurred gold. Garlands for the charity ball waited in damp crates near the entrance, and the musicians' platform stood ready beneath the western balcony. Everything was prepared to look alive. That was what disturbed him. For 3 years, the ballroom had remained shut under the polite fiction of repairs. No one had challenged the lie because great houses are allowed many fictions if the silver remains polished. In truth, Sebastian had closed the room the morning after Lillian left Boston. He had told the steward the floor required attention, the curtains had faded, the acoustics displeased him. All nonsense. He had closed it because every inch of that room remembered the exact place where she had stood when he chose the whispers over her eyes. He could still see it. Pale blue gown, white glove folded in her hand. Face lifted, not proudly, but with the terrible steadiness of someone refusing to fall where others had gathered to watch. He had told himself, for a year, that he had acted with discipline. The Harper scandal was damaging. Lady Caroline's warning had come from a source society trusted. Letters had been mentioned. A marriage broker had been named. His aunt had urged caution. His friends had said a duke must never be trapped by sentiment. The room had leaned one way, and he, coward that he had not known he was, had leaned with it. Yet memory had become less obedient over time. It no longer repeated Lady Caroline's careful phrases. It repeated Lillian's. "You were mistaken in your courage." The sentence had outlived every excuse. It had followed him into his study, into carriages, into church pews, into sleepless hours when the house settled, and he heard, not ghosts, but consequences. "Your Grace." His steward stood several paces behind him with a list in hand. "The final invitations have been confirmed. Lady Caroline Mercer has accepted. Mrs. Harper has not replied, but Miss Harper's school received the invitation by express." Sebastian did not turn quickly. "Has Miss Harper answered?" "Not yet." The answer should have relieved him. It did not. The thought of Lillian absent felt like the old wound continuing. The thought of her present felt like judgment given human form. "Leave the Harper invitation open," he said. "Of course, Your Grace." The steward hesitated. "Lady Caroline has requested that the floral arrangements near the south doors be white roses." Sebastian's jaw tightened. White roses had been Lillian's favorite before the ballroom taught him that even flowers could be used as weapons. "No, Your Grace. No white roses. What shall we use instead?" He looked through the narrow gap between the ballroom doors, where dusk-colored velvet waited to be hung along the windows. Green ribbon on the donation tables. Silver blue flowers if they can be found. The steward made a note, wise enough not to ask why. After he left, Sebastian entered the ballroom alone. His footsteps sounded too loud on the polished floor. He walked to the center, where 3 years earlier society had formed a circle without appearing to do so, every fan, glass, and jeweled hand contributing to the invisible wall around one powerless woman. He stood where Lillian had stood. It took effort, not physical effort. The kind a man spends when he finally enters the room inside himself where his worst act has been waiting patiently. From that position, he saw what she must have seen. Lady Caroline by the marble column, the musicians above, his own figure in black across the floor, the doors behind her too far away. He understood, with an ache that made breath difficult, that she had not merely lost him that night. She had lost the right to be believed in a room where his word would have been enough to shield her. He had not needed proof to defend her long enough to ask for truth. He had only needed courage. A laugh drifted from the corridor, light and familiar. Lady Caroline entered without waiting to be announced. wrapped in a traveling cloak trimmed with gray fur, her expression arranged into nostalgia. "Sebastian," she said, pausing at the threshold. "How strange to see this room awake again." He turned. "Lady Caroline." Her eyes moved over the ballroom, measuring the flowers, the draperies, the absence of white roses. "You have changed the palette. The charity is for girls' education. I thought the room should look less like a funeral for innocence." The phrase landed between them. Caroline's smile held, but only through training. "How moral you sound. The years have made you severe. The years have made me observant." She crossed the floor slowly, her gloves brushing the back of a chair. "I heard you send invitations broadly, even to the coast." There it was. Soft, casual, poison disguised as interest. Sebastian looked at her fully. "Yes. How generous. Is it? Some people are more comfortable when the past remains undisturbed." "The past was never undisturbed," he said. "Only unchallenged." For the first time, something watchful sharpened in her eyes. "You speak as though expecting trouble." "I am expecting guests." Caroline laughed lightly. "Then I hope every guest remembers proper conduct." Sebastian looked toward the center of the ballroom again, seeing Lillian's pale face in memory, hearing the music resume too softly after she left. "So do I." Lady Caroline studied him, and beneath the polish of her smile, concern flickered. She had counted, perhaps, on the same man she had known 3 years ago, proud, susceptible to reputation, careful with society, frightened of scandal under the name of honor. But the ballroom had been closed too long for him to remain entirely that man. When she left, the room seemed clearer. Not clean, not forgiven, only clearer. At sunset, Sebastian stood alone beneath the chandelier as servants lit the first lamps for rehearsal. The glass caught fire above him, multiplying light across the floor where silence had once chosen cruelty. He did not know whether Lillian would come. He did not know whether she had burned the invitation, laughed at it, or placed it unread in some drawer by the sea. But if she returned, he knew this much. He would not ask the room what she was worth. He would ask why he had ever let the room answer for him. The invitation remained unanswered until the morning of the ball. Lillian Harper had carried it for 3 days between the schoolhouse and the cottage by the sea, not because she could not decide, but because some decisions require the heart to walk around them before entering. She taught as usual on Monday, correcting sums and guiding small fingers through loops of ink. On Tuesday, she read aloud from a book of American history while rain tapped the schoolhouse roof, and one girl asked whether women were ever remembered properly. Lillian answered, "Only when someone refuses to let the page close too soon," and felt the green-ribboned letter beneath the papers in her desk like a second heartbeat. On Wednesday, she walked home at dusk with the invitation tucked inside her glove and the Atlantic wind pulling at her cloak. Mrs. Harper was waiting by the stove, mending the hem of a silver-blue gown that had once been pale enough for innocence and was now altered into something quieter, stronger, more difficult to dismiss. "You have decided," her mother said without looking up. Lillian removed her gloves slowly. "Yes." "Because of the letter?" "Because of my name." Mrs. Harper nodded, as if that answer had been the only one worthy of the journey. The gown had been remade from an old dress belonging to a better season, its bodice softened with new lace, its skirt trimmed without excess, its color caught somewhere between sea mist and evening steel. It was not designed to dazzle. Lillian had no wish to enter Waverly House as decoration for their guilt. She would enter as evidence that survival could have grace without asking permission. The next afternoon, mother and daughter traveled south by train, then carriage, through towns already touched by autumn. Lillian watched fields, church spires, and stone walls pass beneath a low sky. With every mile toward Boston, memory tried to become present. The road where she had once laughed after a winter lecture. The dressmaker who had extended credit and then sent a regretful note after the scandal. The hotel where her mother had sat awake all night while Lillian stared at a wall and learned that pain could be silent and still occupy every inch of a room. When Boston appeared through the carriage window, Lillian did not shrink. That, more than anything, told her she was ready. Waverly House received guests at dusk. Its windows burned gold against a violet sky, and carriages lined the circular drive like polished beetles in the evening chill. Music floated faintly through the open doors, tentative at first, as though the ballroom itself had forgotten how to carry sound. Lillian sat still while her mother adjusted the white gloves at her wrists. "You do not have to read the letter if the moment is wrong, Mrs. Harper said. "I know. You do not have to speak to him. I know. You do not have to be brave for every woman who has ever been doubted by a room." Lillian looked at her mother then, and the tenderness in that warning nearly undid her. "No," she said softly. "Only for the woman I was when I left it." Mrs. Harper took her hand for one brief moment, then released it before sentiment could weaken either of them. "Then walk slowly. Let them understand you are not fleeing." The footman opened the carriage door. Cold air entered. Lillian stepped down, the silver-blue hem of her gown brushing the stone. At the entrance, two servants announced names in clear voices, and she heard familiar titles pass before her like ghosts from a life she had outgrown. Lady Caroline Mercer had arrived early, of course. So had half the families who had watched the old scandal ripen into entertainment. Lillian placed the folded letter tied with green ribbon inside her small evening reticule and entered the hall. The first person to recognize her was not Sebastian. It was an elderly woman near the staircase, who had once invited Lillian to tea and later pretended illness whenever the Harpers called. Her eyes widened. Her fan stopped moving. The second person turned to see what had startled the first. Then a third. Recognition moved through the entrance hall, without words, traveled beneath the archway, and slipped into the ballroom ahead of Lillian like a chill entering under a door. She walked toward it anyway. The ballroom of Waverly House stood exactly as memory had preserved it and entirely changed. The chandeliers were brighter, the floors more polished. The western windows held the last fire of dusk, turning every glass and jewel into a quiet flame. Green ribbons marked the charity tables. Silver-blue flowers stood in tall vases where white roses had once mocked every sentimental arrangement in the room. Lillian noticed that change and hated that she noticed. The music faltered when she crossed the threshold. Not stopped, not yet, but stumbled. A violin lost a note. A dancer missed a step. Conversations thinned into air. Then the room saw her fully, and silence bloomed with the speed of spilled ink. Lillian did not look for Sebastian. That was the discipline she had promised herself. She let the room look first. Let the women who had whispered over fans see her face unhidden. Let the men who had believed convenience over evidence see that she had not returned ragged, pleading, or broken into a shape that would comfort them. She was older, clearer, untouched by their permission. Across the ballroom, Duke Sebastian Waverly turned from a conversation beside the marble column, and the moment he saw her, everything in his expression that society had ever admired became useless. The perfect composure, the noble reserve, the practiced calm of a man born to hold rooms steady. It all failed him by a single breath. Lillian saw him then because the room forced her gaze in his direction, but she did not move toward him. She only inclined her head with the courtesy one gives a host, not a wound. That small distance struck Sebastian harder than any accusation. 3 years ago, she had looked at him as if his belief mattered. Now she looked as if his disbelief had become part of history, painful but no longer sovereign. Lady Caroline, standing near the donation table in a gown of ivory silk, watched the exchange with a smile too careful to be relaxed. She crossed the room with all the elegant leisure of a woman determined to reach a fire before it spread. "Miss Harper," she said, her voice sweet enough for nearby guests to pretend it was kindness. "How unexpected. I had heard the coast suited you so well." Lillian turned to her. "It did. And yet you returned to us." "No," Lillian said gently. "I returned to the room. Not to the judgment it once mistook for society." A murmur trembled through the nearest circle. Lady Caroline's smile tightened. Sebastian took one step forward, then stopped, because he understood with a shame that felt almost physical that this was not his moment to manage. Lillian had not come for his rescue. She had come with Dusk at her back, a letter in her reticule, and a name no longer willing to bend beneath silence. Lady Caroline Mercer had always understood rooms better than people. She knew where to stand beneath chandelier light, when to lower her lashes, how long to pause before speaking a sentence meant to wound without appearing vulgar. That evening, however, the ballroom did not obey her as it once had. Lillian Harper's return had altered the air. Conversations resumed, but cautiously, like birds returning to a branch after a sudden sound. The orchestra began another waltz, but the music stayed thin at the edges. No one wished to be seen staring, and yet everyone stared through mirrors, over shoulders, behind fans, across the rims of crystal glasses. Lillian accepted a glass of water from a passing footman, thanked him by name after glancing at his silver badge, and moved toward the charity table where donations for girls' schools were being recorded. It pleased her, in a grim, quiet way, that the evening had been arranged for education. 3 years ago, Boston society had taught her a lesson in how quickly a woman's reputation could be rewritten by people who never had to sign their names beneath the lie. Tonight, perhaps, she would teach the room something in return. Sebastian watched from near the marble column, unable to look away and unwilling to approach without permission. He had imagined seeing her again 100 ways during 3 years of sleepless restraint. In memory, she was always pale with hurt, turning from him with that folded white glove in her hand. In guilt, she was always asking why he had not believed her. But the woman standing across the ballroom now asked nothing. That was what broke him. Lillian did not search for rescue in his face. She did not avoid him like a frightened girl. She moved through Waverly House as if pain had once happened there, yes, but no longer owned the floor beneath her feet. She spoke to an elderly patron with calm politeness. She placed a modest donation on the table with her mother's name written beside it. She admired the school ledgers, asked how many students would be supported, and corrected one figure gently when the clerk miscopied a total. Every small action revealed the cost of what he had lost. She had become steady without him. No, worse. She had become steady after him. Lady Caroline saw Sebastian watching and decided the room needed to be reminded of its old arrangement. She crossed to Lillian with 2 ladies beside her, both elegant, both eager to appear innocent of curiosity while feeding on it. "Miss Harper," Caroline said, her fan opening with a whisper of painted silk. "I must say, your work on the coast has been much admired. Teaching girls, is it? How noble. Exile can be made useful when one has sufficient discipline." The nearest guest quieted at once. Lillian turned from the donation ledger. Exile is a word used by people who believe every room worth entering belongs to them. Caroline's smile did not fade, but it sharpened. "How philosophical you have become. I hope the years away have brought peace." "They brought clarity. A rarer thing," Caroline said, "though clarity can be unkind when it arrives too late." Lillian looked at her then, fully, and several people near them seemed to stop breathing. Not as unkind as a lie arriving early. Caroline's fan stilled. Sebastian took another step, but Mrs. Harper, standing near the edge of the room, saw him and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not yet." He stopped. The rebuke was deserved, even from across a ballroom. Lady Caroline's eyes flicked toward him, then back to Lillian. "My dear, I hope you have not returned to reopen unpleasant matters. Society has a mercifully short memory when one allows it." "No," Lillian said. "Society has a convenient memory. Mercy requires conscience." A murmur moved outward, spreading from circle to circle. Caroline laughed softly, enough to suggest Lillian had become dramatic, not enough to seem alarmed. "Still so earnest. That was always your difficulty. You took every whisper as if it were a verdict. Because whispers become verdicts when powerful people repeat them in silence." This time, the words reached Sebastian and stayed. He felt them as one feels a hand placed over an old bruise. He had not invented the lie, but he had given it shelter. He had allowed silence to wear his name. Caroline stepped closer, lowering her voice only enough that those nearby had to lean in to hear, which was exactly her intention. "You should be careful, Miss Harper. A woman who returns to defend her reputation may remind people why it was questioned." Lillian set her glass on the table. The delicate sound rang clearer than the music. She opened her reticule and touched the folded letter tied with green ribbon. She did not remove it yet. Power, she had learned, did not always lie in striking quickly. Sometimes it lay in making the room wait long enough to recognize its own hunger for humiliation. "Lady Caroline," she said gently, "did the years teach you nothing new?" Caroline's brows lifted. "About what?" "About the danger of putting your own handwriting beneath another woman's ruin." The fan closed. Not loudly, not visibly enough for anyone far away to understand. But Sebastian saw it. So did Lillian. So did the ladies beside Caroline, whose expressions changed from amusement to caution. The orchestra, sensing a shift it could not name, faltered once more. Sebastian's breath tightened. Handwriting. Green ribbon. Lillian's return was not merely courage. It was evidence. Caroline recovered with remarkable speed. You speak in riddles. No. I have spent 3 years learning to speak plainly. Lillian drew the letter from her reticule, but kept it folded in her gloved hand. The green ribbon caught the last light of dusk from the western windows. This room once heard my name stained by suggestion. It did not ask for proof then. I wonder whether it has learned to require proof now. The silence expanded, first around the charity table, then across the polished floor, then up toward the chandeliers where candlelight trembled in crystal drops. Sebastian looked at the letter and felt the past, which he had kept locked behind pride, begin to open without asking his consent. Lady Caroline's face remained beautiful, composed, almost serene. But the color beneath her skin had changed. If you mean to make a spectacle, she said softly, remember that spectacles rarely restore dignity. Lillian held the letter at her side, her posture straight, her voice calm. No, truth restores dignity. Spectacle only reveals who was comfortable without it. And in that moment, the ballroom that had once waited to watch Lillian Harper break began to understand that she had not returned carrying heartbreak. She had returned carrying the record of who had taught the room to doubt her. The green ribbon in Lillian Harper's hand became the center of Waverly Ballroom more completely than any chandelier. No one spoke. Even those standing too far to read the gesture understood that something had shifted from rumor into evidence, and evidence has a different weight in a public room. Lady Caroline Mercer held her fan closed now, one gloved thumb pressing against the painted ribs with such force that the silk bent slightly. Miss Harper, she said, still sweet, still smooth. You would be wise to consider whether private correspondence belongs in a charitable gathering. Lillian looked toward the donation table, where the names of girls' schools lay written in careful ink. This gathering exists for the education of girls. Let it begin with the lesson that a woman's name should not be destroyed by private correspondence used as a weapon. A murmur traveled through the ballroom, quieter than applause and far more dangerous. Sebastian stood several paces away, unable to move without making the moment seem his to command. For 3 years, he had imagined apology as a sentence he might one day offer in private. Now he understood the arrogance of that hope. The harm had been public. The doubt had been public. The silence had been public. Anything less than public truth would only protect the room from seeing itself. Lillian untied the ribbon with steady fingers. The paper unfolded slowly, its creases softened by years of concealment. Mrs. Harper moved to stand near her daughter, not touching her, only close enough that no one could mistake Lillian for alone. Lady Caroline's eyes flicked toward the doors, then toward Sebastian, as if searching for the old version of him, the one who would preserve appearances before honesty. He did not come to her aid. His stillness was late, but it was no longer hers to use. Lillian began to read. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The ballroom leaned toward it because guilt and curiosity often share the same posture. If the Harper girl is made to appear ambitious before the Duke is pressed to declare himself, he will withdraw without scandal. Men of his rank rarely risk reputation for affection when the room doubts the woman first. A glass clicked against a tray. Someone whispered Lady Caroline's name, then stopped. Lillian continued, each line placed cleanly into the silence. The marriage broker need only be mentioned, not proven. Suggest that her family's debts were hidden with intent. Suggest that her letters were part of a scheme. It will not matter whether the Duke asks her. A man raised to protect a title will fear being laughed at more than being unjust. Sebastian closed his eyes for one brief second. The words entered him not as revelation, but as confirmation of his cowardice. Caroline had understood him then. Worse, she had counted on him accurately. Lillian lowered the page. The letter is signed in Lady Caroline Mercer's hand and was sent to Mrs. Harper's former companion, who kept it because she found the instruction dishonorable. She sent it to my mother after her conscience outlived her fear. Lady Caroline's face had lost its careful warmth. This is absurd. A letter taken out of context can be made to sound monstrous. Then provide the context in which these words are honorable, Lillian said. The room waited. Caroline looked from face to face and found, at last, that society's appetite for scandal had turned upon the hand that fed it. You think this restores you? She asked, her voice lower now. You think reading old bitterness changes what people believed? Lillian folded the letter once, not hiding it, only sparing it from becoming entertainment. No, it changes what they are responsible for believing now. That answer silenced even those who had come only to watch. An elderly gentleman near the refreshment table bowed his head. A young woman beside the windows covered her mouth, eyes shining with the shock of recognizing how easily any one of them might have been made into a story. Sebastian stepped forward then, slowly, stopping not beside Lillian but before the assembled guests. His face was pale beneath the candlelight. Miss Harper owes this room no further explanation, he said. The old authority in his voice returned, but this time it did not shield pride. It served truth. 3 years ago, I heard insinuation and mistook it for evidence. I allowed silence to do the work of accusation. For that, the failure was mine before it belonged to anyone else. Lady Caroline stared at him, as if betrayal had suddenly become unfair when turned her way. Lillian did not look grateful. He did not deserve gratitude for arriving late to decency. But she listened. That was more than he had earned. Sebastian turned toward Caroline. You will leave Waverly House. Her chin lifted. You would dismiss me before everyone? No, he said. You dismissed yourself when you used everyone. The sentence fell cleanly. No raised voice. No spectacle beyond truth. Caroline looked around the ballroom one final time, saw no rescue, and walked toward the doors with her fan closed in one rigid hand. The crowd parted for her, not with respect, but with the instinctive distance people keep from a mirror that has shown them too much. When the doors closed behind her, the ballroom remained silent. Not the old silence that had watched Lillian break. This silence was lower, humbled, ashamed. Lillian placed the letter back into her reticule. Please continue the charity records, she said to the clerk at the donation table. The girls should not lose an evening because adults required one lesson. A breath moved through the room, almost a laugh, almost a sob. The orchestra did not resume at once. No one knew what music belonged after justice. Sebastian watched Lillian return to the ledger and sign her mother's donation with a hand that did not tremble. In that moment, he understood that she had not come back to punish him. Punishment would have centered him. She had come to restore herself. And that was why his heart, which had survived guilt, loneliness, and 3 empty years, finally broke under the unbearable grace of seeing her stand whole without needing him to make it so. After Lady Caroline Mercer left Waverly House, the ballroom seemed to awaken inside its own shame. The chandeliers still burned. The silver-blue flowers still stood in their tall vases. The charity ledgers remained open beneath green ribbons, and the musicians still held their instruments, uncertain whether beauty had any right to resume after truth had entered so plainly. Lillian Harper stood at the donation table with her mother beside her, signing the final line of their contribution as if her hand had not just turned 3 years of whispers into public evidence. Around her, people began to move again, but differently now. Fans lowered. Voices softened. Several women who had once crossed streets to avoid the Harper name looked at her with the stunned discomfort of those who wished to apologize without paying the full cost of having needed to. One elderly patron came first, her pearls trembling faintly at her throat. Miss Harper, she said, I believed what I should not have believed. Lillian looked at her with calm eyes, then believed differently now. The woman bowed her head and stepped away. Another followed, then another. No apology repaired the old wound, but each one placed a stone where silence had once been a pit. Sebastian Waverly watched from near the center of the room, feeling the weight of every bowed head as if each had arrived 3 years too late through his own door. He did not approach her. Not yet. A man who mistakes late remorse for entitlement has learned nothing. Instead, he turned to the steward and spoke quietly. The full proceeds of tonight will go to the Harper Coastal School and the Boston Girls Fund, equally. The steward blinked. Yes, Your Grace. And have a public correction printed tomorrow. Lady Caroline Mercer's letter will be submitted to the trustees with Miss Harper's permission only. No paper leaves this house unless she chooses it. Yes, Your Grace. Sebastian saw Mrs. Harper hear the instruction. She met his gaze for a moment, and there was no gratitude in her expression. There was appraisal, the look of a mother measuring whether a powerful man had finally become safe enough to stand in the same room as the daughter he had failed. He accepted the judgment. Lillian, meanwhile, had moved toward the western windows where dusk had deepened into violet night. The glass reflected the ballroom behind her. Candles, jewels, flowers, faces turned quieter by conscience. She could see Sebastian in the reflection too, standing alone beneath the chandelier. No longer the center of the room, though every title in it still bent toward him. Once, that sight would have pulled at her heart like a tide. Tonight, it touched a scar and found it closed enough to ache without opening. The orchestra, perhaps guided by instinct, began a slow air rather than a dance. No one moved onto the floor. The music merely filled the space that accusation had emptied. Sebastian waited until the final note faded before he approached, stopping several feet away, so her reflection held him before his presence did. "Miss Harper," he said. Lillian did not turn at once. "Your Grace." The title sounded correct, distant, and deservedly cold. "I will not ask you to forgive me. That is wise. I will not ask you to believe I was deceived beyond responsibility. That would be wiser." Her voice was quiet, but each word had the clean edge of something tempered by pain. Sebastian lowered his eyes. "I broke your heart because I trusted the room more than the woman standing in it." Lillian turned then. The candlelight lay across her face softly, revealing not the girl he had wounded, but the woman who had carried that wound until it became part of her strength. "No," she said. "You broke it because trusting me would have cost you something in front of people whose approval you valued." The correction struck him with the force of mercy, because it named the sin accurately. "Yes. Do not make your failure sound poetic. It was smaller than that. Cowardice usually is." His breath caught, but he did not defend himself. "Yes." Around them, the ballroom pretended not to listen and failed completely. Lillian saw that, and for once she did not mind. The old harm had been public. Let the new truth stand where the old lie had stood. Sebastian lowered himself to one knee on the polished floor. A faint shock moved through the room, sharp as crystal touched by a spoon. Lillian's eyes widened, but she did not step back. He did not reach for her hand. "Do not mistake this for a claim," he said. "It is not a proposal, not a performance, and not a request that you soften the truth for me. It is only the posture I should have taken when the room first rose against you. Lower than your dignity, lower than my pride." The silence became immense. Lillian looked down at the Duke kneeling where society had once watched her stand alone. The sight did not heal everything. It did not return the 3 years, the sleepless nights, the careful rebuilding of a life by the sea. But it placed his remorse where she could see it without being asked to carry it. "Stand up," she said. "Not because you deserve it. Because I will not let this room turn my restoration into another spectacle about you." Sebastian closed his eyes briefly, then rose. "You are right. Learn to stand against the room before you ask to stand beside me," she said. He bowed his head. "I will." She believed, perhaps for the first time that evening, that he meant it. Belief was not forgiveness. It was only a candle, and candles could go out if neglected. Mrs. Harper approached with Lillian's cloak folded over one arm. "The carriage is ready." Lillian accepted it and looked once around the ballroom. The faces that had once watched her leave in disgrace now lowered themselves beneath her gaze. Not all in shame, some in respect, some merely because power had changed direction and they followed power by instinct. It did not matter. She had not come to teach them virtue. She had come to return her name to herself. At the doors, Sebastian spoke once more, very softly. "May I write to the school about the donation arrangements?" Lillian paused. "You may write to the school trustee. And to you?" She looked back. Not yet. The answer was not cruelty. It was freedom. He received it as such. Lillian stepped out of Waverly House into the cool night, no longer the girl who had fled through snow with a folded glove and a broken heart. Behind her, the ballroom remained lit, chastened, and awake. Some women do not return to be chosen again. They return so the room that shamed them may finally learn to bow. The next morning, the coastal schoolhouse opened beneath a sky the color of clean slate. Lillian Harper arrived before the children, unlocked the green shutters, and stood for a moment in the quiet room where rows of small desks waited with ink bottles, readers, and slates. The air smelled of chalk, salt wind, and wood smoke from the iron stove. It was not Waverly House. There were no chandeliers here, no polished floor to reflect judgment, no women with fans sharp enough to cut a name apart. Yet this plain room had given Lillian something the ballroom never had, a place where her voice could be useful without first being approved. Mrs. Harper came in carrying a bundle of fresh paper, looked at her daughter's face, and said nothing for a while. Silence, between them, had become a language of respect. At last, she asked, "Do you feel changed?" Lillian set the attendance book on the desk. "No," then, after a breath. "But the room changed." Her mother nodded. "Sometimes that is enough for one night." The children arrived in twos and threes, cheeks red from the morning wind, boots damp from the path, hair ribbons loosened by weather. They knew nothing of Waverly Ballroom except that the promised donation had somehow doubled before breakfast. That innocence steadied Lillian. She taught the alphabet to the youngest girls, fractions to the older ones, and copywork from a sentence she wrote carefully on the board. Truth does not become rude because it arrives where lies were comfortable. One girl squinted at the line and asked whether grown-ups often forgot that. Lillian looked toward the window, where the sea flashed between clouds. More often than they admit. Near noon, a messenger arrived from Boston with a sealed packet addressed not to Lillian, but to the school trustees. She recognized the Waverly crest and did not touch it until Mrs. Harper stood beside her. Inside were formal documents, a pledge for the school fund, a public correction to be printed in Boston and sent to the coastal paper, and a short note in Sebastian's hand addressed only to the trustees, not to her. He had obeyed. The realization moved through Lillian quietly. Obedience from powerful men is often called humility only when it costs them something. This had cost him the comfort of rushing toward absolution. He had written nothing personal. No plea. No memory polished into apology. Only arrangements, corrections, signatures, and a line at the bottom. Miss Harper's consent is required before any private letter is reproduced beyond the trustees' records. Mrs. Harper read the line twice. He listened. "For one day," Lillian said. "One day is not nothing." "No," she folded the papers carefully. "But it is not everything." In Boston, Waverly House also learned to exist after the truth. The ballroom was not closed again. Sebastian forbade it. Not because reopening it repaired harm, but because shutting it would have allowed the house to mourn its own discomfort rather than confront what it had permitted. The morning after the ball, he stood in the center of that bright room while servants removed wilted flowers and gathered empty glasses. The parquet floor held faint marks from hundreds of careful steps. Near the western windows, where Lillian had faced the room with Caroline's letter in hand, a green ribbon lay forgotten beneath a chair. Sebastian picked it up and held it for a long moment. Then he carried it to his study and placed it beside the first draft of the public correction. His steward entered with newspapers stacked beneath one arm. "Your Grace, there will be talk. There was talk before. This talk may be unkind to the house." Sebastian looked at him. "Then the house may endure what Miss Harper endured without cause." The steward bowed his head. That afternoon, 3 letters came from families who suddenly wished to express sympathy to Lillian Harper through him. Sebastian sent them back unopened with a note. Apologies should not travel through the man who failed to defend her. It was a small discipline, but discipline was what he understood, and perhaps discipline could be retrained toward honor. Lady Caroline's name disappeared from guest lists by evening. Not formally at first. Society rarely condemns its own with the speed it condemns the vulnerable. But invitations slowed. Calls went unanswered. Her fan, once a weapon of suggestion, became an object people noticed and looked away from. Sebastian took no pleasure in it. Pleasure would have made justice smaller. Weeks passed. The coastal school received its funds. The Boston Girls Fund expanded. Lillian's name appeared in print beneath a correction so plain that no elegant person could hide behind confusion again. Mrs. Harper cut the notice from the paper and placed it in the schoolhouse ledger, not framed, not displayed, simply kept where records lived. One evening, after the last student left, Lillian found a letter on her desk from the Waverly steward, requesting approval for additional scholarships in her school's name. Enclosed was no personal message, only the proper forms and a return envelope. Lillian sat by the window as dusk gathered over the sea. She could feel the old ache, softer now, asking whether trust might ever grow again where public doubt had once rooted. She did not answer it. Some questions deserve seasons, not sentences. She signed the forms as trustee and added one line beneath her name. The scholarships must be awarded without regard to family reputation. 2 days later, the reply came, as Miss Harper directs. No more. No less. She placed it in the ledger and looked out at the gray water, remembering Sebastian kneeling beneath the chandeliers, not to possess her, but to lower pride before truth. It had not healed everything, yet healing had never been a single night's work. It was copywork, repeated until the hand learned steadiness. It was a room kept open after shame. It was a man who wrote to the trustee because he had been told not to write to the woman. It was a woman who read his restraint and did not mistake it for forgiveness, but did not deny that restraint had begun. At Waverly House, Sebastian returned to the ballroom every dusk for a month, not for music, not for guests, but to stand where Lillian had stood and let memory instruct him without mercy. At the coastal schoolhouse, Lillian taught girls to write their names firmly enough that no rumor could make them vanish from the page. Between those two rooms, no promise passed. Only correction. Only patience. Only the first quiet evidence that a broken heart, once restored to itself, may choose when and whether another is allowed to approach. By spring, the sea outside the coastal schoolhouse had turned from iron gray to a blue so clear it seemed almost innocent. Lillian Harper still arrived before the children, still opened the green shutters herself, still wrote the day's sentence on the board before the first boots sounded on the steps. Yet the school had changed. There were new books on the shelves, new slates stacked by the stove, new scholarships for girls whose family names had once been considered too poor, too complicated, or too inconvenient for polite support. Every document bore careful language approved by the trustees. None of it asked Lillian for gratitude. That was how she knew Sebastian Waverly had continued listening. He did not write to her directly for months. He wrote to the school, to the trustees, to her mother when Mrs. Harper's consent was needed for the memorial reading fund, and every letter kept the distance she had demanded. Not cold distance, honorable distance. The kind that leaves a gate open without standing in the path. Lillian read each page, signed what required her hand, and placed the rest in the ledger where facts belonged. Some evenings, when dusk gathered above the water and the children had gone home, she felt the old ache move softly through her. It no longer entered like shame. It entered like weather over healed ground. In Boston, Waverly House changed as well. The ballroom remained open. Not every night, not for vanity, but for charity meetings, public lectures, and twice for gatherings where girls from the scholarship schools were invited to dance without being measured by family fortune. Sebastian stood at the edge of those evenings and watched the room learn new manners. He never allowed Lady Caroline's name to be spoken as entertainment. He never claimed moral victory from exposing what he had once helped shelter. When people praised his generosity, he answered, "Correction is not generosity." Slowly, society learned that the Duke's silence had changed sides. It no longer protected comfort. It protected truth from being softened for those who found it embarrassing. One afternoon in May, a formal invitation arrived at the schoolhouse, not for a ball, but for the dedication of the Waverly Harper Scholarship Library in Boston. Lillian read the name twice. Waverly Harper. Her mother, sitting near the window with mending in her lap, watched her over the rim of her spectacles. He used both names. He asked the trustees first. "And you approved it?" Lillian folded the invitation. "For the girls." Mrs. Harper smiled faintly. "Of course. The dedication took place at dusk, because some rooms must be revisited at the hour when they once failed. The library had been built inside the former blue sitting room of Waverly House, where Lillian had once read aloud to Sebastian's aunt before gossip taught the household to treat her name like a stain. Now the shelves held primers, histories, poetry, account books, and maps. Girls from Boston and the coast stood in clean dresses beside their teachers, whispering with the excited restraint of children told to be proper in a room too beautiful to ignore. Lillian wore a simple gown of soft gray blue and carried no letter, no proof, no weapon. She did not need one. Her name was on the brass plaque by the door. Mrs. Harper stood beside her, proud and quiet. Sebastian approached only after the trustees had spoken, stopping with the same respectful distance he had maintained in every letter. "Miss Harper," he said, "Your Grace." The title remained, but it no longer cut. He looked toward the shelves. "The final account has been placed with the trustees. No funds pass through my personal discretion. I saw. The girls will choose some of the books themselves. then the library may become wiser than its founders. A small smile touched his face, brief and humbled. That is my hope. Silence rested between them, no longer hostile, not yet easy. Around them, children ran careful fingers along book spines as if touching doors. Lillian watched one small girl lift a heavy volume with both hands and hold it against her chest like treasure. This is good work, she said. Sebastian bowed his head. It began too late. Many good things do. He looked at her then, not as the man who expected forgiveness because he had suffered, but as one who had learned that remorse must remain useful even when no reward follows. May I say something personal? Lillian considered. The old answer would have been no, born from self-protection. The new answer did not have to prove strength by refusing every door. Yes, I loved you badly because I loved my place in the world more carefully than I loved the truth. I have spent months trying not to turn that sentence into poetry. It is not poetic. It is shameful, but it is true. Her breath caught, though she did not show it much. Beyond the shelves, the last sunlight moved across the brass plaque and touched both their names. I know, she said. I do not ask where that leaves me. Good. I ask only whether, someday, I may begin again as a man who tells the truth before the room grants him permission. Lillian looked toward the open library door, through which the distant ballroom could be seen, lit but empty. She remembered leaving it in snow, returning to it at dusk, hearing it go silent around her restored name. She remembered him kneeling, then obeying distance, then building something that did not require her affection to justify its existence. Trust did not return like lightning. It returned like handwriting practiced after injury, slow and uneven, but possible. Someday, she said, you may write to me. Not as trustee. Sebastian's face changed very slightly, as if hope had entered but knew to remove its hat. And if I do, write plainly. I will. Do not ask for the past back. I will not. Do not ask the room to bless what you have not earned alone. He lowered his gaze. No. Lillian looked at him for one long moment, then gave the smallest nod. It was not forgiveness completed. It was not a promise of love restored. It was a door opened by an inch, and because he had finally learned the cost of doors being closed without hearing, he treated that inch as sacred. Later, when the dedication ended, the girls filed out beneath the new plaque, laughing softly over the books they hoped to borrow. Mrs. Harper took Lillian's arm as they descended the steps. Are you at peace? Her mother asked. Lillian looked back at Waverly House. The ballroom windows glowed beyond the library wing, but their light no longer seemed to summon or judge her. I am not what they left me as, she said. That is peace enough for tonight. Behind the glass, Sebastian stood alone beside the shelves, not watching her as possession lost or hope won, but as a man witnessing the woman whose dignity had taught his house to become useful. Years later, people would say the Duke and Miss Harper rebuilt trust slowly, through letters, school ledgers, public corrections, and seasons of careful truth. They would wonder why she had not forgiven him sooner, because society prefers quick forgiveness from those it wounds. But Lillian knew better. Some women do not return to be chosen again. They return to choose themselves so completely that even love, if it comes back, must learn to knock.